Well, today
Thank
we are
you.
joined by Jeff Nielsen of Three Pillar Global. First off, let me thank you for joining us today.
Happy to be here. Thank you.
All right, and can you tell us a little bit about yourself and your role at Three Pillar Global?
Absolutely. I am the Senior Vice President of Engineering at Three Pillar Global, which means I lead an organization of a little more than 500 software development professionals, organized into roughly 60 teams in 4 different locations across the globe. And at Three Pillar, we collaborate with businesses to create successful software products, build seamless customer experiences, and lots of other kinds of goodness related to software products.
All right.
Me personally, did you want to hear a little bit about my background? Or
Sure, absolutely.
Got a job as a software tester right out of high school. Grew up as a developer, tester, architect, project manager. Got introduced to these ideas of extreme programming in about the year 2000, and have been sort of an agile aficionado since then, both as a participant and then later as an executive in both consulting and product organizations.
All right.
So that's me in a nutshell.
Oh, fantastic. Well, as an Agile aficionado, you're going to be speaking to us today about Agile and about its role in 2015. To
That's
start
what I
things off,
understand.
in your own words, what is an Agile mindset or the Agile mindset, and how does it play into business decisions?
Yeah, so agile mindset, or the agile mindset, is a concept that several of us have been talking about and writing about in the agile community for the last couple of years. And it's really an attempt to describe what is this thing that's at the core of what we're calling agile software development. If you look at how the agile movement started, it didn't start with the Agile Manifesto in 2001. Instead, it was a bunch of folks trying to figure out better ways to do software development, each having different methodologies like Scrum that came out, or extreme programming, or DSDM. And so the Agile Manifesto was really these guys getting together and saying, what is it that we have in common? And of course, the document that we all know and love now, the canonical text of Agile software development, the Agile Manifesto, was an attempt to describe at a very high level this thing that we have in common. But what we've noticed is, as folks try to look at that and try to look at various Agile practices, you end up with a lot of people who have sort of the form of Agile but are missing the essence of Agile. And so what is that essence? What is that thing that the values of the Agile Manifesto are trying to describe? And that's what I call the mindset. And it's really a way of thinking about how software development is most successful. That's how I guess I'd characterize it, is what's your basic belief system about how software development works best. And so the things from the manifesto, like individuals and interactions and working software, customer collaboration, responding to change, those are all an attempt to describe this overall mindset of how you get the best software. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And, what does it take to achieve an Agile mindset? You talked a little bit about, capturing the essence. What does it take to get that Agile mindset, and how long should someone expect for the take to adopt this frame of mind?
Well, that's a good question and a hard one to answer, because if it's really about a way of thinking, about a belief system, people don't change their belief systems overnight. Our beliefs are built on our past experiences and our interpretation of our past experiences, and people go to therapy for years to try to reinterpret their past experiences, of course. So in some ways, the answer is, well, it can take a generation to if you really are talking about a shift in thinking. Now, I've been at places where there's been significant progress made in less time than a generation in sort of helping people think about software development differently and what works. But it takes repeated experiences with a new approach, with new things that you haven't tried before you really start believing differently, I think. So I know it's not a very satisfactory answer.
No, it is, because it actually brings up my next question here. So there are different shades of gray, so to speak, to an Agile mindset. It is a process, not a black and white binary 0 and 1.
Yeah. I mean, you're not going to hit a day in your company where you say, "Oh, congratulations, everyone now has an Agile mindset." I mean, we necessarily come at these things when folks go to an organization tries to adopt Agile, they, of necessity, start with some specific practices, because you can't just hand someone a set of values and say, well, start believing this now. This is our new approach. Just believe these 4 things.
That doesn't work.
Yeah, well, I haven't found it. And so you get specifics, practices like, well, okay, we think that developers and customers should sit closer together. We think they should talk daily. We think you should work in these short time boxes. What if we talk about user stories rather than requirements? So you start with these specific practices, and if you're successful, people execute on practices a little bit on faith, and then they start to say, this actually is working a little better than what we used to do. Why is that? And then that's the kind of thing that can change a belief system over time. But what you need is a whole bunch of people having a whole bunch of good experiences before the collective belief system changes. So absolutely. I think there's people that you could say, and I never really described what I think the Agile mindset is, which I think is basically a belief that the best software gets created in a collaborative, iterative, trial and error type situation with lots of open communication, lots of healthy interactions. So you may or may not believe all of that, right? You may believe that, well, no, my most successful projects have come when we took a lot of time to specify up front and really think hard about what was needed before we started building. And if someone's had some good experiences that way, you're not going to convince them that no, we don't need an upfront requirements phase, or if someone's been burned enough times in the past by not enough testing, you're not going to convince them overnight that no, we test as we go and we don't need long test cycles at the end. So it's a problem in that way, because you can have different people with different beliefs, and they're all trying to work together to get an optimal result.
Okay, so why really is the Agile mindset an ideal mentality to have for taking enterprise to the next level, to really improving on what's already been done?
Well, that's a good question. So a couple thoughts of that. So you may have heard that we're moving into the age of the customer.
Yes.
There's this guy Jim Blasingame, I think, who wrote a book about that. This idea that for the first time in several thousand years, the balance of power has shifted from the seller to the customer. The customer now has more information, more communication, tools at his or her disposal, and so the customer is really in the power position. And so one natural result of that is that you can't get away with bad products anymore. As my boss, David DeWolf, likes to say, for so many businesses, whether you're a software business or not, your software is your product. It's a primary way that you interact with your customers. And in this age of the customer, people aren't going to put up with bad product. Bad software product can kill you literally, in terms of your revenues and your reputation. And so the reason I think that an Agile mindset is not just ideal but necessary is that it's the only way I know to build great products. You can build adequate, okay, decent products that mostly get the job done, with some other mindsets. But the folks that I know that have built these really great software products all have what I would describe as this Agile mindset. So enterprises have to figure out how to get more of that.
So in the age of the customer, it's not enough just to be good. You have to be great, and in order to be great, the Agile mindset is the way to do that.
Yeah, I don't know. Everyone can't be great. It's like everyone can't be above average, but
right.
but certainly it's a lot costlier to be mediocre or poor.
Okay.
I guess that's the way I would characterize it.
Okay. Now, why is implementing Agile methodologies challenging for enterprises and larger organizations?
Well, so if we go back to, again, what is the Agile mindset? It's a belief that you're going to get good products by trial and error, by iterating quickly and learning as you go. And frankly, the bigger an organization is, the less it is set up to or the less optimized it is to take risks, I guess. The less okay it is to be seen as failing in some way.
Right.
So you've got a 5-person startup, and everyone expects you to try some stuff, and if it doesn't work this week, we'll try something else next week, and we'll just hang on for dear life, and your reputation doesn't suffer because you're a startup. But somehow it's less okay for a larger organization or an enterprise to be seen as having tried something and failed. So that's one big challenge, I think, in terms of just adopting that mindset, really believing in that mindset. It's a hard sell if you go into someone and say, the way you used to do this, where you figured out what you were going to build and how much it was going to cost, and you budgeted for that and planned for that on a yearly or bi-yearly cycle. You want to know the truth? What got planned in those sessions wasn't actually the right thing to build. It's a hard thing to sell.
Oh, yeah.
It's a hard thing to believe. If I put all this work into a plan, I've put a lot of thinking in, to believe that there's something more to be learned, that there's actually a better product out there that I can't get to until I start.
Mm-hmm.
That's a very hard thing to believe. So
kind of like with both internal and external perceptions, it's almost a little bit easier for smaller organizations to adapt and implement an agile mindset.
Well, I think that's true for a change of any significance. Large organizations develop a culture, they develop a way of doing things, they become risk averse, they become, of necessity, they become focused somewhat on preserving the organization itself, which is necessary. There's more people that want to be involved in decisions, and probably more people that ought to be involved in decisions. And so where we're talking about learning quickly and learning as you go and making decisions based on new information, that just gets harder the more people you have. A great example of this is what happens with this practice of user stories, which if you've spent any time in an agile project, you've heard the term user stories. So user stories started out as this lightweight construct for communicating ideas and planning with just enough information to plan responsibly and to track. But if you look at the way user stories get implemented in an organization of any size, in most cases, not in all cases, it's become another requirements artifact. Instead of calling it specs, we call it stories. Instead of calling it tickets, we call it stories. But we still have this multi-step process for getting a story written and approved, and before you know it, you've end up with this process that takes five steps and 2 months before something's approved for development. So that's an example of, we've adopted the language of Agile, even the practice of user stories, maybe even the Mike Cohn's template as this kind of user I can, so that. But what we're doing, our behavior exhibits this belief that we really need to go slowly and carefully. And I'm not trying to suggest that every large organization is slow. Just that there's a strong tendency toward wanting to involve more people in decisions. It's very hard to decentralize power the bigger you get, and it's scarier to be seen as taking risks and failing.
Right, and I'm glad you brought up the fact of more people being involved and more people having the ability to make choices, because as Agile grows both in popularity and adoption, do you think this will result in a team restructuring in the year 2015 as smart creatives inherit more responsibility?
Well, certainly a lot of big organizations are experimenting with different structures and different ways of empowering teams. That's another. You use the term smart creatives, which, as far as I know, comes from Eric Schmidt in his book about the Google Way, and he talks about how these folks that are both technically savvy, have some business acumen, and are creative are really going to rule the roost.
Right.
and that the way to structure a company in the day where smart creatives and the age of the customer is really to push power down to small teams and let them go. I think Google's a great example of that. I think there's plenty of other companies that are good examples of letting stuff bubble up organically. And yeah, I think as companies experiment with that model of really empowering teams, and how do we strike the right balance between empowerment at the team level and still having coherence as a larger organization? How do we budget and be responsible and accountable to our stakeholders, but at the same time leverage this good thinking and great results that can really only happen best in small teams that are as autonomous as possible.
Okay. Now, getting back to Agile and its impact in 2015, how can businesses make Agile a reality for 2015?
Those that haven't yet.
Yeah, I know it's a very broad question, so take your time.
How can they make Agile a reality? Well, anyone these days that's involved in software in any way is foolish to ignore the lessons of the Agile movement. I think that the kind of things we've been talking about, getting people not just to do the practices of Agile, but really understand what is our corporate belief system, what's our culture, what's our belief around how innovation happens. What I hope to see happen with Agile is that it becomes less of a thing in itself and more of an enabler towards working differently and thinking differently. So, for an organization that hasn't adopted Agile on even a small scale, go out, hire a coach, try it. For organizations that have it working well at a small scale or trying to figure out how to scale it, keep trying. There is no one. This was a hot topic at the Agile 2014 conference. Is the right way to scale Agile? I don't think there's one way or even necessarily one model that's appropriate. But keep experimenting with that, with scaling and finding that balance between empowering teams and achieving overall coherency.
Okay. Now, Jeff, you're a very well-respected expert in Agile development, and as you said earlier, an Agile aficionado. So I'm going to ask you, kind of look into the future here. In broad terms, what do you think the future holds for Agile, both in 2015 and possibly beyond?
So one thing we haven't talked about today, Cameron, is the DevOps side of Agile and the DevOps movement that I see gaining tremendous traction. You're familiar with what I mean by DevOps?
Yes, absolutely.
So this idea of automating not just the development process, but automating the process of getting new code into production and kind of the single push button. And we've seen tremendous growth in that area over the last couple of years. And I expect that DevOps will do for the enterprise what these practices like automated developer testing and continuous integration refactoring did for smaller teams. I still remember the feeling of power I got on an Agile team when I realized that I could go from making 2 or 3 changes an hour with a responsible code build, compile, test cycle to multiple changes a minute with tools like JUnit and in the olden days we didn't have Jenkins, it was cruise control and just the tools that enabled that cycle to speed up and enabled the feedback loops to speed up. So I expect that DevOps will have that kind of effect at the enterprise, because you automate your whole process of getting new ideas into production, and now suddenly you can put out multiple releases per day instead of a release every quarter or so, which is even good for a lot.
Right.
That changes the dynamic significantly. So as Agile has been progressing along this dimension from smaller to bigger, which we saw early on in the early 2000s is, well, this is great for small toy projects. Okay, well, this is great for small teams, but it won't work for a larger team. All right, this is good for small companies, but it won't work for a larger company. I mean, no one's saying it's not going to work in a large company. But as we've progressed along that dimension, which I expect to continue in 2015, just kind of people cracking the nut on how you get an Agile mindset into large companies. Another dimension that I see is this dimension of going from practices that assume we have a flatter, that it's cheaper to change stuff. So a lot of the Agile practices like short iterations and lots of collaboration and trying stuff. Those assume that the cost of change is low enough to make that feasible. So shifting from those agile project management practices to the agile technical practices like automated testing and DevOps, which are real enablers of a flatter cost of change curve. I think early on, some of us were worried that the project managers had taken over the agile movement, and we lost all this interesting thinking, like from extreme programming about not lost it in individual situations, but lost it as a whole. And I see that DevOps has caused a resurgence in the realization that if I've got these practices that significantly flatten the cost of change curve, that I can work in totally different ways. So I think that'll happen at the enterprise.
Okay. And do you think that more organizations will begin implementing Agile?
They might not call it Agile. And I think the numbers on adoption or already of agile practices are pretty staggering. I mean, there's something like 80-90% of organizations are doing agile in some way. So I don't know there's that many more left, at least to start
right.
Start an agile adoption. But I think that if we go back to the original question about mindset, I think that once people realize that I'm free to make multiple releases of my software per day, that all the things I thought I knew about how to responsibly develop a product, well, not all of them, a lot of them will change. And I think a lot more people will adopt this mindset of trial and error and frequent iteration and collaboration and high touch. Here's another way to think of that. So if Agiler is an enabler, what's it an enabler for? You may have heard of the term design thinking.
Right.
I see Agiler as one of the key enablers for a company to execute on design thinking, which is this intersection between not solving a specific challenge, but improving a customer's overall situation, gaining empathy for the customer, figuring out what our constraints are, and figuring out how to create an improved situation, an improved experience at a micro and a macro level. If you can get good at agile practices, that enables you to have a lot more of this design thinking permeate your culture, whether you're a software company or not.
So you think whether or not they officially implement Agile in official terms, a lot of companies and organizations may implement an Agile mindset, whether or not they realize it or not.
Yeah, I expect it to kind of go the same way that object orientation went, several decades ago, where it used to be a thing, right? Oh, we're going to adopt OO now, right? And you don't hear people having OO initiatives anymore. It's just the way that stuff's done. I expect that to happen with Agile. I expect it to become less of a thing, more of just the way that stuff gets done. But we'll look back and we'll say, oh yeah, we're working pretty differently than how we thought we ought to be working in the 80s or 90s.
And that's a pretty good quote there. Agile is going to become less of a thing and more of a way that stuff gets done. I like that. That's a good quote.
Yeah.
So one final question here. In your opinion, is there an industry where Agile has grown the most, and is there an industry that is going to be ripe for a widespread Agile adoption going forward?
I'd be hard pressed to pick one industry that's grown the most in terms of Agile. You mean?
Yes.
Certainly internet companies where their main focus was getting people to interact with software over the internet. Whether that's Amazon or Netflix or those companies obviously have been at the forefront of these movements and adopting an agile mindset on a wide scale. If I had to pick one that I think is right, I'd probably say government.
Okay.
I spent several of the previous 5 years of my life working closely in some federal programs, and talk about risk aversion. One of the common things I'll hear is, well, we can't operate the way those Silicon Valley guys operate because we have to be responsible. We are responsible for the well-being of the populace at large. So we can't just throw caution to the wind and I think that's a little bit of a misunderstanding, because when we talk about taking risks and being willing to fail, it's not about taking risks that endanger people's lives or that wouldn't be responsible government. It's about acknowledging that a lot of these things, that creating a better world, a better a better place, a better experience for our populace is about experimentation, is about trial and error. And our traditional procurement processes in government, the decision-making processes, don't let us iterate quickly enough to really create those optimal experiences. And I've seen that change. You know, we saw with sort of the aftermath of healthcare.gov some significant changes from the White House on down about the kind of thinkers that they want leading government IT projects. And so I think that's ripe for, I know several leaders in the federal government personally, and going to see great things there.
All right, great.
In terms of more of an agile approach, an agile mindset.
Well, fantastic. That actually wraps up our interview today. And once again, this was Jeff Nielsen of Three Pillar Global, and he spoke to us today about Agile and its role in 2015. Thank you so much, Jeff.
You're welcome. Thank you, Cameron.